Okay, so what we've talked about so far with respect to Federal Reserve policy has been the Fed using open market operations, and that is most of the time exactly what the Federal Reserve does. It's going to buy and sell bonds from banks in order to hit its target rate, and it's going to change the extent to which it buys or sells in order to change that target rate, which we've just gone through, contractionary, expansionary policy. Those are open market operations. So there are a few other tools that the Federal Reserve can use and sometimes does use in order to achieve these different policy objectives. One such policy tool, which is very rarely used but sometimes occasionally is to change the reserve requirements. So if you remember, go back to our study of the monetary system, and all banks are subject to a legal reserve requirement. Which is typically summarized by a required reserve ratio of 10%. So 10% of deposits is sort of the standard. So that has to be held on hand at the Federal Reserve Bank, and there's no way banks can get around that. So obviously, to meet that requirement in the day-to-day transactions gives rise to the federal funds market. Sometimes I may be short, so I have to borrow from other banks. And so if the Federal Reserve Bank changes that requirement, they're going to effectively change the demand for reserves, which is going to potentially affect the interest rate. And so when I change the reserve requirement, if I increase it, I'll call it increase reserve requirement, what that's going to do then is that's going to increase demand for reserves in the federal funds market, right? Because now I have, let's say, 20% of reserves required. So now I'm going to need to go to the federal funds market more often to meet that requirement in my day-to-day transactions. And so that's going to have the effect of increasing the Fed's interest rate or the federal funds rate. So if I kind of draw a little graph down here of the federal funds market, let's call this R1. Open market operations are designed to affect the supply. And the first two of these are going to affect demand. So changing the reserve requirement, I can either increase the reserve requirement, so increase reserve requirement, and that's going to force the federal funds rate up, or I can decrease the required reserves, which would decrease demand for reserves and decrease the interest rate. So, or I could decrease required reserves, which is going to decrease the real interest rate. So those are the different options the Fed could use if it changes the reserve requirement. Now, it typically doesn't use that because it's kind of a roundabout, less direct way to accomplish the goal than an open market operation. All right. But we'll see, some of these can be used when we hit what we call the zero lower bound, where the nominal interest rate has gone to zero. The Fed would not have any other tools for open market operations left. Okay, so the other thing it can do is to change the interest it pays on reserves held at the Fed. Now, typically, that interest rate is just zero. There is nothing, right? You bank has reserves at the Fed. They're just there. They don't earn any interest on those. But the Federal Reserve can increase and decrease the interest rate paid on reserves. So let's say that they increase the interest rate on reserves. Right, so now I'm going to pay banks 2% interest if you keep reserves on hand at the Fed. Well, that makes keeping reserves on hand at the Fed very attractive. And so banks are going to keep more reserves at the Fed because they earn interest. And that is going to imply that demand for federal funds in the federal funds market is going to decrease. Why? Well, I'm happy to keep my reserves there. So I'm not going to run out as often as I did before. And when demand goes down, as we can see, that's going to decrease the nominal interest rate or the federal funds rate target, right? So the Fed wants to decrease its target rate. One option it can do is it can offer interest on reserves held at the Fed. So what's going to happen is banks are going to keep reserves on hand at the Federal Reserve Bank, and that's going to decrease their demand for reserves, and that is going to decrease the target interest rate. Go the other way, if I decrease that interest rate on reserves, that's going to start to increase demand. Banks now don't want to keep as many reserves on hand at the Fed, and that's going to tend to increase its target interest rate. And so we actually did see the Federal Reserve doing this from 2015 to 2019. They were decreasing the interest rate that they paid on reserves, which they started paying during the Great Recession, it was called, from 2007 to 2009. And so really these first two are just two different ways of changing demand for reserves by changing around the amount of reserves that banks are going to be keeping at the Federal Reserve Bank, either directly by changing the legal requirement or indirectly by changing the benefit to banks of keeping those reserves on hand at the Fed. All right, so another way that the Fed can operate, which it's not really going to necessarily directly affect the federal funds rate, although it does to some extent, you could think of it in that way, is rather than having banks go to the federal funds market to get reserves, the Federal Reserve can actually lend to banks directly. So this is what is typically called, or the Fed is referred to as, a lender of last resort. And what that means is that, in a really severe financial crisis, lending markets tend to dry up or stop functioning, right? So in a really bad financial crisis, which the Fed encountered in 2007, 2008, banks don't want to lend to other banks. Why? Because I don't know which banks are going to survive and which banks aren't. So I don't know who's going to pay back my loans and who won't. And so therefore, I stopped going to the federal funds market to lend my reserves. And so then what happens is banks don't have sufficient reserves and they don't have anyone to borrow from. They can actually go to what's called the discount window, and they can borrow those reserves from the Federal Reserve Bank. So the Federal Reserve Bank can effectively increase the quantity of reserves floating around by lending those to banks directly and skipping the federal funds market altogether. And so this doesn't necessarily directly affect the federal funds rate because it's not happening in the federal funds market, but it would generally be analogous to decreasing the federal funds rate. So that's the goal of the Fed here, is to increase the quantity of reserves that banks have, which in the end is hopefully going to increase the amount of lending. Okay, so that is lending from the discount window. And last but not least, an important topic called quantitative easing. And so this is what we call an unconventional monetary policy. And so what I say when it's unconventional is I'm not changing my target for the federal funds rate anymore by buying and selling short-term bonds. And so what the Fed does here is the Fed actually buys longer-term assets or bonds from banks. Right, so typically what they buy is short-term Treasury security, so like a 3-month Treasury security, which is a bond that pays out over 3 months. And so the Fed will start buying bonds and assets of maturities of 3 years or longer. Sometimes even they'll start buying mortgages from banks, which is one of their assets that mature in potentially 10, 15, or 30 years. And so the goal of this is, the same as the goal of regular monetary policy, which is ultimately to decrease the long-term interest rates. And they're trying to do that by effectively increasing reserves that banks have. And they can do this conventionally with open market operations, or they can go to what we call quantitative easing, where we're buying longer term assets. So this doesn't affect the federal funds rate at all because we're not buying and selling reserves in that market anymore, right? I am buying and selling longer term bonds. And so this is typically used when we hit what is called the zero lower bound, or when the federal funds rate is zero, which it is right now. The Federal Reserve can't use conventional policy. So I can't decrease my target rate anymore. I can increase reserves all I want, but it has no impact on the interest rate. And so how do I start affecting longer term interest rates then is to go and interact in that market directly. So I'm going to buy and sell, typically buy these longer term bonds in the hopes that I decrease the interest rate on those bonds, and that stimulates economic activity. So we'll kind of come back to quantitative easing in a little bit, but what I'd like you to do, so that's a lot of information there, is to look at this question on Learning Objective 2 on Canvas, and that will give you a little bit of practice thinking through some of these issues in monetary policy. So then up next, we're going to take a look specifically at what I alluded to, the zero lower bound and quantitative easing.